Chip and I lived in East Tennessee all our lives. We grew up together, went to college together, and even worked at Eastern Search and Rescue together. Eventually, we ended up being a team. My name is Don, and I no longer work at Eastern Search and Rescue. In the fall of 2017, late in the season, Chip and I went out on a call. It was a bad one. An airplane had crashed deep into the mountains just north of our location. The mountains there are old and dense and can be treacherous even to experienced hikers who went up there on purpose. But a bunch of city slickers, injured, alone with no cell service, well, likely wouldn't survive very long. Our co-workers, Matthew and Paul, were in another chopper and were headed out to find the wreckage. The bad thing about finding airplane wreckage is that we have the location where the plane went down, but sometimes that's only the point of impact. The wreckage can be scattered over vast areas and into deep valleys. The canopy of trees makes it nearly impossible to locate the plane, or what's left of it and its occupants. Paul and Matthew had gone a bit ahead of us and had alerted us that they spotted what looked like the fuselage of the plane. It was high on a mountaintop, and the rest of the plane was probably scattered down the mountainside. They were going to try to land on top of the mountain in a small clearing, and Chip and I were going to fly low, see if we could spot the rest of the plane. The mountain was falling into shadow. Chip yelled that he had spotted a wing jutting up through the trees. I turned and we made a second pass. The rest of the plane was even farther down, next to the river valley. I didn't like taking the helicopter low between shadowed mountains, but we were going to have to land somewhere. Maneuvering carefully, we scanned for any place wide enough to set the bird down. Finding a semi-flat rocky outcropping on the side of the river, I lowered us. The trees were dangerously close to the rotors as I descended, praying there wouldn't be a sudden blast of wind, as there sometimes was in the mountains. I was close enough to breathe a sigh of relief when it happened. The hard wind caused the helicopter to tip and yaw toward the trees. I overcorrected and the tail caught in the tangle of limbs. Overcorrecting once again. I sent us into a spin that proved almost fatal. We were thrown into a spin. The tail hit a craggy outcropping and we tumbled down too quick to even brace for impact. Thankfully, we had been low enough that the crash didn't maim either of us, but I had managed to move far enough away from the original target that we would have to walk about 1,000 feet, cross the river, and then trek up the mountainside. Our comms were completely busted too, and there were no cell service that far into the mountains. If we found the survivors, Paul and Matthew would find us, and we wouldn't be stranded. It all seemed pretty cut and dry. Simple. The paperwork and the explanations for crashing the bird, that wouldn't be so cut and dry, or simple. We secured our packs and took anything we could feasibly carry to the plane crash. The flashlights had come through the crash landing pretty much unscathed, for which we were both thankful as dark fell quick in the mountains. We couldn't cross the river where we were going to land. The water was too deep and the current too strong. And continuing up the shoreline, we finally found a narrowing where it was safe to cross. The late fall heat mixed with the sweltering humidity had already sapped us of most of our energy. The crash landing had pumped my adrenaline, and when it was spent, I was left nauseous, dizzy, and shaking. The water was cool, and I dipped under twice to try to quell the sickly feeling, not thinking it would make it worse as we hiked up the steep mountainside. To keep our bearings, we made our way to the outcropping and began our ascent. Neither of us heard the thumping of rotor blades, and we figured it meant Paul and Matthew had landed safely and were on their way down the mountain. There had been 17 people, and the pilots on the plane heading for Boston. Chip said Bostonians were noteworthy for being tough as nails and survivalists. I just hoped that he was right, because I'd been born and raised in the mountains, and was having trouble keeping up after our little topsy-turvy crash that left neither of us injured. I couldn't imagine what those people from the plane were going through. I was relieved when we finally came upon the first piece of wreckage. It meant we were getting close. Chip started yelling out to any survivors to let them know that we were on our way. Then after 2 or 3 minutes of yelling and hearing no answer, he gave me a worried look. That's not normal. I told him the humidity and the denseness of the forest probably were muffling his voice. They couldn't hear him. Deep inside, though, I feared the worst. Maybe they were all dead or injured so badly that they couldn't respond. The plane had been ripped to pieces during the ascent. We found a wing, part of a motor, a few bags of belongings that had been scattered, and yet no survivors. A man's shoes stood alone in a shaft of dying sunlight, shining against the muted colors of the forest floor. A woman's dress hung on a pine branch and flapped lazily in the breeze about 20 feet above us. Farther up, a child's well-loved teddy bear lay staring up at the sky with one remaining eye. His stuffing jutted out the side of his head and was caked with leaves and bark and dirt. The silence was the worst, though. I don't remember hearing any birds or insects. The silence draped everything with a feeling of foreboding, and my insides coiled. My ears strained to hear any sounds other than our own. And soon, we walked into a large area where the ground was covered in shattered glass. The diamond-shot sparkles reflecting the last of the day's light into our eyes. It was hard to look at, and we had to squint to make it through. A large portion of the plane was just ahead. Chip ran, yelling to any survivors again, and again I heard absolutely no response. I didn't run. I was expecting the worst, and after seeing that teddy bear, well, I wasn't sure I would be able to handle what we might find. Plodding slowly toward the wreckage, I let Chip run ahead. He had always been the hardier of us, stomach of cast iron, and he registered absolute 0 on the squeamish scale. As I tried to get around a fat tree, gripping its rough bark to keep my balance, something hit the top of my head. My first thought was bird shit. Cursing, I reached up and tried to swipe it from my hair. When I looked at my fingers, they were painted in blood. I gagged and quickly moved away from the tree, looking up. I fell over a root, but my eyes caught sight of a leg dangling a dozen feet up. Just a leg. A muscular, hairy leg with no shoe on the foot. I scrambled to turn around and warn Chip, but it was too late. He screamed at me that they were all dead. As I spun and stood, I saw more body parts stuck in trees, lying on the ground near the big chunk of plain, and I closed my eyes as the world spun. Taking a deep breath only caused me to smell the blood. Everything seemed to be splattered with it. Chip had bravely moved to the opening and looked inside, and all I could see was a few bloody passenger seats and a mangled, thin arm sticking out of a broken window. Chip emerged, pale and visibly shaken. It was the first time I'd seen him so affected. He shook his head and looked around at the gory scene. Neither of us had ever witnessed such a grotesque outcome to a plane crash, and we'd both seen our share of them over the years. Something seemed off about the whole thing. After gathering myself, I took a good look at the scene again. Why are there blood spatters up there? I pointed above the line of windows, above the arm jutting out. Where are the heads, the torsos? Fear crawled up my spine and gripped me like a skeletal hand at the base of my skull. My nerves sizzled. I walked around the chunk of plain and farther up the mountain. The sun gave only a sliver of light, and I had to get the flashlight. I swung the wide beam of light left and right, searching for torsos. A plane crash didn't leave only severed limbs in its wake. There had to be actual bodies somewhere. Chip joined my search, but we found nothing but a few more legs and arms. Finally, unable to yell anymore, and unable to see well enough to continue up the mountain without getting lost in the darkness, we headed back down toward the river. We would stay there until daylight. Maybe by then Paul and Matthew would show up. We couldn't figure out where they had gone. Had they crashed too? The likelihood of 3 aerial mishaps in one day in such a small area would be against the odds, but come on, where were they? As we were skirting the wreckage, we noticed a trail. It was bigger than a deer trail, and our lights shone on what seemed to be a man about 50 feet down it, and partially hidden by the foliage. I yelled out to the man, but he didn't move. Chip started toward him, but I grabbed his arm and told him to go slow. It was dark, and we didn't know if that was a living man, or a corpse, or, well, God forbid, some sort of animal. We walked slowly down the path, my heart lurching in my throat at every shadow and every noise. When we were about 15 feet from the thing, we could see that it was not a man. It was shaped like one, but it was too thin, its arms and legs too long. Stopping, we trained our lights on him, and the bushes and leaves threw great shadows across him. His back was still to us. I called out again, not nearly so loud, and he stepped into the shadows. And immediately, Chip swung his light, trying to find him again. About that time, something growled behind us. To be exact, it was more than one something. It was several. And without thinking, I took off running. Facing a pack of wild dogs at night with no weapon was not my idea of smart. Chip was on my heels. The path wound and double-backed on itself, slowing us down considerably. Whatever chased us didn't sound like dogs, though. You see, dogs make a certain galloping sound when they run. The things chasing us had a steady 2-foot sound as they pursued. Chip turned, but I didn't. I kept running, thinking that he was still behind me. I didn't want to see what was back there. He could always fill me in when we reached safety. Soon I stopped seeing the wild arcing of Chip's light, and I risked slowing down enough to turn my head back and shine my light toward the trail. And one scream tore through the heavy air, and there was a giant squelching sound. And then, silence. My throat was so dry and tight, I couldn't yell for Chip. I wanted to go back and find him, but I knew that would mean me dying too. Chip was gone. That scream had assured me of that, and that squelching, ripping sound. Well, my brain conjured up images of Chip's ripped-apart body. If I had gone back, I was certain legs and arm would be all I'd find. I looked back and then forward several times. My body seemed stuck in limbo, trying to decide which way to go. And I moaned and forced myself to continue on the path. Without Chip by my side, no, I didn't run, but I kept moving until I had to stop and catch my breath. When I reached for my pack to get water, well, I realized it was gone. I didn't remember taking it off, but there is so much from that evening and night that are foggy that it doesn't surprise me. With no sounds of being pursued and my flashlight flickering with the onset of dead batteries, I moved into the trees and huddled in a thicket with my back to a huge oak tree. It was the closest thing to a shelter that I saw. I have never, ever felt so exposed in my life as I did sitting there. I was completely cut off from the world, and the first stirrings of tears for the loss of my best friend began as I stifled a sob. Pulling up my knees, I crossed my arms on them and buried my face. I forced my emotions into a balance as I squeezed my eyes tight and counted my breaths. And then, within a couple of minutes, the skin on my neck began to crawl as the fine hairs stood on end. The pit of my stomach clenched. My hearing amplified. Something was close. Something was watching me. Was it stealthily advancing on my crouched and unprotected form? Paralyzing fear gripped me as I raised my head and strained to see into the inky blackness all around. Then something scraped against the tree bark a few yards away. I focused in that direction. Nothing happened for several minutes. I began to unfurl quietly and pushed myself into a crouching position. The scraping sound came again, directly behind me, and I spun, flicking on the flashlight just in time to illuminate an elongated hand, bony, dark fingers, and long, thick nails retreating out of sight behind the tree I had just propped against. I couldn't turn my back to that thing and run. Instead, I kept the flickering, dimming light trained on the spot and moved backwards. I think I was whimpering. I recall a sound like that, but I'm not sure where it was coming from. I felt as if I were in a nightmare. You see, fantasy and reality blended and blurred as I crept backwards. My terror multiplied when I bumped into something that breathed down my neck and then growled in my ear. My body took over and I spun away from the thing. Its claws ripped at the tender flesh of my side, and warm blood cascaded, soaking my pants. I caught only a glimpse of its elongated, malformed head as the flashlight dropped from my hand. The light bounced and flickered when it hit the thin soil, giving me flash-shot images of the creature. Its mouth was open wide as if to bite, and I saw jagged, oversized teeth. The flashlight spun when it hit the ground again, and the world seemed to be in slow motion as I finished my spin and started running blindly. And I ran. I emerged from the forest at the edge of the river and wasted no time plunging into it and swimming to the other side. On the other shore, I turned. I could make out the wiry, almost human shapes of 3 creatures on the other shore. They growled and made yipping noises and bit at each other when they got close. They paced there for a few minutes, and then I couldn't see them anymore. I had no way of knowing if they could swim or if they would, and so I stayed close to the shore, keeping the skinny line of sand in my vision, and I kept moving until daylight. After sunrise, I slowly made it back to our downed chopper and sat on the sand. Other search and rescue members finally spotted it, and I was taken to the hospital. I had lost a lot of blood. When I was fully conscious again, I was told that Matthew and Paul hadn't made it either. They had successfully landed and launched a search, but had never reached the fuselage. All they found of them were arms and legs, same as with Chip and all the passengers of the plane crash. I don't know what the hell we ran into up there. I'm not even sure if I want to know. I've moved to Chicago since then, and I work in a cubicle. No more mountains. Every morning when I get dressed for work, I'm reminded that whatever those monsters were, they were real. I have 4 jagged purple scars covering the whole of my right side to prove it.